Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. Now this time around it is going to be one covering a topic that many of you guys have been requesting for quite a while, and that is Mixed Lores of Magic. And in this video specifically we will be covering Mixed Lores of Magic in multiplayer. I do intend to make one separately for single player at some point. However, obviously the two are very different, and there are in fact a few extra characters and heroes that can in fact get Mixed Lores of Magic in campaign. And so I did want to keep that separate before moving on to it. So here we are going to be focusing on multiplayer. And in my opinion, one of the big difficulties with covering Mixed Lores of Magic is that all but one of these mixed lores are intrinsically bound to a specific character. It can be very difficult to find the point where the qualities of the character or caster end and the qualities of their magic actually begins. A character can be amazing with equipment and abilities and itemization and have a pretty mediocre or even bad lore of magic, but the character is still overall insanely powerful because of all those other traits. And then it's like, okay, you happen to be a caster on top of it. And so what we're going to be focusing on here, or trying to focus on here, is specifically the magic and what it brings to the table for the faction it's in. Does it bring something unique to the table? Does it bring something you can't do with other lords? How it compares to other lores of magic that it's composed of, and does it bring something to the table that you can't do with an alternate caster or an alternate source of magic for that faction? And so we're going to be trying to focus on that explicitly here, trying to ignore the other traits that make some of these lords great or bad, and just focusing on the magic specifically. And of course, that is a bit of a narrow-minded view, but I don't think it's fair to, when we're focusing on mixed lores, to simply judge them by the quality of the overall character utilizing them. So that is going to be the methodology here. And without further ado, we're going to dive right in with Count Noctilus. Now, Noctilus is, in my opinion, going to drop down at C tier. And I'm sure some of you guys are kind of surprised by that. Noctilus is, of course, a staple character for Vampire Coast. He's kind of been the meta lord pick since the faction's release. Arguably is still the meta lord pick, even though Luther's kind of clawed his way up in the world, especially with Noctilus's nerfs. All that aside, Noctilus gets a mixed lore of magic of vampires and shadows, and in my opinion, falls flat on his face in comparison to especially just straight lore of vampires. And here's why. He does get two passives, which is nice. You do get both the lore of shadows and vampires passive, but the lore of shadows passive is not particularly good for Coast. Most of your units are very slow. Getting an extra 12% speed on top of that is not a game-changing boost. It's not something you're going to bother with. Getting extra 2 mobility on zombies is not something you're going to do. You're just not going to bring Shadows passive most of the time. So you do have the Vampire passive. It's nice to have both, but really you're not using both. He does get, fortunately for him, both of the strong vampire, or the strongest in my opinion, of lore vampire spells. He gets both the Zombie Summon as well as Invocation of the Heck. And that does push Noctilus obviously up, and it is critical for him. The fact that he does get those two spells means that he's actually a very, very strong lore choice, because those two spells alone are amazing. The rest of his spell roster is not all that good. You get 2 nuke spells. You've got the you've got the Wind of Death as well as the Pit of Shades, neither of which are a particularly powerful spell in multiplayer. They're both very unreliable. You're kind of relying on your opponent screwing up and getting caught out. And it's made even worse by the fact that when you're playing as Coast, most of the enemies you're facing are not particularly elite. There are not high-value targets to be trying to nuke with these very powerful wind spells or vortexes. So, yeah, those 2 spells are basically useless. Then you do have Melkoth's Miasma, which isn't a bad spell. It does double as a snare and a bit of damage, which is very, very nice. But once again, are you really going to be prioritizing that with the Vampire Coast? And odds are you won't. You can use it to weaken the enemy cavalry a little bit and cripple key targets in specific moments. And odds are, if you're going to bring a third spell with Noctilus, it is going to be Melkoth's Miasma. But when push comes to shove, it's not that valuable spell for Vampire Coast. You're not playing a kiting playstyle. You're basically playing attrition through gunfire and zombie summons. And Melkoth's Miasma doesn't necessarily synergize too well with that. And so it's kind of a mess spell, though certainly the better of his spells. And finally, we have Wither. Now, this isn't a bad spell. It's minus 30 armor and minus 8 leadership to the afflicted unit. In Overcast, it does an AoE. But for Coast, it's kind of useless. You don't need to debuff enemy armor because the vast majority of your damage is AP. Whether that's monsters or guns, all of those are AP. So unless you're doing some weird depth guard or non-AP zombie build, you are not looking for armor sundering effects. You don't care. So that right away is a mark against Wither. And the leadership debuff isn't bad, but you're not going to be spending an entire spell, in my opinion, to just drop enemy leadership by 8 points as Vampire Coast. You're not going to do that. Let's be honest here. So, because you're going to be saving that Winds of Magic for Invocation of the Heck and Zombie Summons. So in my opinion, honestly, Noctilus's lore, it doesn't bring anything new to the table for Vampire Coast. It arguably takes away abilities that could be useful for alternate builds. For example, you miss out on the Van Hels's Dance Macabre for lower vampires, which is actually a pretty strong spell if you're trying to buff up a melee line. If you're going for melee rush as Vampire Coast, which you sometimes do, then it's nice to have Van Hels's Dance Macabre, and you can't get that with Noctilus. You don't have the Gaze of Nagash to snipe out single entities. So you're missing out on a lot compared to lore vampires in particular, and you don't really bring anything new to the table for it. So I just don't think he's a particularly good mixed lore, but I will give it a C tier because you do get a little bit of utility out of that Melkoth's Miasma, and so you do get a little bit there, but it's not a great lore in my opinion. Next up, and we are covering the one-off mixed lores before we do cover the two factions with lots of mixed lores of Magic, and that's of course Vampires and High Elves. We are just covering the one-off lores. But next up, we are going to do Mala Morathi, and she's another uninspired mixed lore of Magic. And in fact, I'm going to put her down as low as D tier. She gets a mix of lore of Death, Shadows, and Dark Magic. All those very solid lores and respectable lores in and of themselves. She gets the passive for Death and Dark. The Death passive is nice just because you get more Winds of Magic, so that is a boon. The Dark passive is pretty useless for Dark Elves. Dark Elves have a lot of AP damage. Almost all of their damage output is AP. Their only real exceptions are Corsairs and Sisters of Slaughter for the really meaningful damage output. And so unless you're doing some niche build, you're probably not bringing the lore of Dark passive. You don't care for that. So you really only get the lore of Death passive in practical terms. And her spells are just not that good. You get Soul Stealer, which is really a big selling point for Morathi. You get Soul Stealer. It's a big AoE nuke. It helps heal Morathi and keeps her in fights where normally you wouldn't be able to. And it gives her a greater tankiness than one would anticipate. But the rest of her spell selection isn't that good. Both of her death spells are very niche. You've got Soul Blight and you've got the Doom and Darkness. Now, if you're doing a leadership bomb build as Dark Elves, you probably bring Lokir or maybe Malice. Malice probably not because it's just bad for other reasons, but you're probably not bringing Morathi for a leadership bomb build. And you're probably saving your Winds of Magic for, once again, those Soul Stealers that you can spam, and Melkoth's Miasma, which is the other decent spell she's got to whittle enemies down. So Doom and Darkness is a very niche and pretty unlikely spell for Morathi. Soul Blight is a debuff to enemy non-AP damage, and armor, as we just discussed, Dark Elves don't really care too much about armor. They're a mass AP faction, so who really cares? Almost your entire roster is AP. So getting minus 30 armor isn't a huge value, and that only really leaves the weapon strength debuff. Now, this can be decent against a faction like Empire, for example, which has a lot of non-AP cav, or Bretonnia, which might have a lot of non-AP cav, unless they brought Questing Knights, in which case, ouch. So it can have these niche applications. But once again, it's not something you're going to use when you've got Soul Stealer to bring to the table, and it is a very, very niche spell that you're probably not going to want to bring as your backup. Your backup is Melkoth, essentially, which does this slow chip damage, and then you've got Soul Stealer as the big nuke. And then finally, we do have Pit of Shades and Power of Darkness. Now, Pit of Shades, as we discussed with Noctilus, nukes are just very unreliable in multiplayer. It is, I think, a little better with Dark Elves because you'll sometimes see those big blob fights, which you don't see very often with Vampire Coast. But is it worth bringing Pit of Shades? Probably not. And Power of Darkness gets you more Winds of Magic, but is it enough to justify the self-inflicted harm and the Winds of Magic cost of the spell itself? Probably not. You don't have the benefit of Malekith, who gets this, I believe it's a Circlet of Iron, which increases the amount of casts of Power of Darkness you have, as well as the reduces the Winds of Magic cost of it. So it's not generating you that much more Winds of Magic. You already have Greater Arcane Conduit. You already have the Lord of Death passive. And so, in my opinion, Morathi doesn't really Marathi's mixed lore there doesn't really bring much to the table. The one sole benefit I will give it is that you can spam a lot of Soul Stealers and you can spam a lot of Melkoth Miasma. Really, and even there, it's a bit iffy, but really you can get a bit more of them just because you get the Lore of Death passive. So you get the Lore of Death passive with Lore of Dark, Soul Stealer, really, and Melkoth Miasma. So you can drop a few more spells. I believe she can get 4 Soul Stealers off over the course of a game, which is nice, between all of her Winds of Magic buffing, but really not the most amazing Lore of Magic. You could essentially get Lore of Dark and it would make just about no difference or very little difference to her. And so because of that, it's going to get D tier. It just doesn't bring much to the table. Next up, we do have the Fat Toad, and this guy is a lot better, in my opinion. He's actually got a pretty neat Lore of Magic. He's got a mix of light, heavens, and high magic. Now, the big downside to Mazdamundi's mixed lore is the passives. The passive sucks, because it's the Lore of Heavens passive. For some reason, he only gets 1 passive. I don't know why, but he only gets the Lore of Heavens 1. And that one, of course, is super niche. If you do fight air, it's not a bad niche spell, or passive. But for everything else, it's literally worthless. So yeah, usually you're not bringing your passive. It kind of sucks. His spell selection, though, is not bad. You get Net of Mintok, which is an awesome spell. You can root enemies in place. It allows you to murderize them with big dinos, countercharge with cold ones without actually having to take the enemy charge. It lets you prevent enemies trying to snipe out Mazdamundi. If you went with a sort of wider, spammier build and your opponent tries to dive you with Karl Franz or something like that, you can net him down and be like skedaddle off. That sort of thing. So you've got Net of Mintok, which is really, really nice. You've got the Apotheosis from Lore, and one of the weird things about his lore I should mention is that he gets 1 spell from Light, 2 from High, and then 3 from Heavens. I'm not entirely sure why CA decided to do that, but he does get this distribution. Regardless, you only get a Net of Mintok from Lore of Light. From Lore of High Magic, you get Apotheosis as well as Arcane Forging. Arcane Forging honestly isn't very good. It's just too expensive for the damage it does. And the cooldown debuff, while not bad, is really something that's too niche to be reliable. You're not going to bother bringing a whole expensive spell just for that. So that's not something that you really concern yourself with Mazdamundi. Apotheosis, though, very nice. It can heal Mazdamundi. It can heal other single entities or elites, like for example your Temple Guard. You can help keep them in the fight a little bit longer just by dropping that heal on them consistently. And so it's a nice little bit of utility to have. And finally, you do have the Lore of Heavens, which gives you Comet of Cassandora, which I'm not even really going to cover. It's a bad spell. You don't use it. So Comet of Cassandora is not very good. But you do also get Harmonic Convergence and Curse of the Midnight Wind, which are very good spells for Lizardmen. Curse of the Midnight Wind helps offset the non-AP on your Saurus. It makes them hit a lot harder because you reduce enemy armor. It also reduces the return damage you take because lizards don't have the best combat stats most of the time. So reducing enemy melee attack means that you are able to crank out more damage against the enemy while simultaneously taking a lot less. So that's very nice for Mazdamundi there. And then Harmonic Convergence once again offsets those mediocre combat stats on Lizardmen, and can really help soup up Mazdamundi or a Scarvet or a Carnosaur or Temple Guard or whatever unit you happen to want to soup up, you can soup up. And so, because of that, Mazdamundi is going to have himself B tier. He has 4 very solid spells. He has really bad passives, which is what drags him down, in my opinion. I'd put him at an A tier if he had at least 1 decent passive. If he had, for example, if he had the Lore of High Magic passive. If he had Shield of Sapphire, I would easily put Mazdamundi up to A, but unfortunately he doesn't, so he nets himself a B tier. And he does have 2 of those subpar spells, so it's a B tier for him, but still a very, very respectable Lord. And has a really nice Lore of Magic there. Next up, we do have one of the only heroes in the game with a mixed Lore of Magic, and that is the Branch Wraith. And this Woodland Lady actually has a really good mixed Lore of Magic. It is a mix of life and shadows. She only gets the Shadows passive, which is definitely a mark against her. And despite that, she's going to net herself an A tier. And you might be wondering why, but it's because she has a really good spell selection, especially for the faction she's in. You get, from Lore of Life, you get Awakening of the Wood, which is probably her weakest spell. It can be used to nuke squishy units like Peasant Bowman or something, but really it's a spell you're probably not going to use very often. So that is like the one weak spell on her lineup. Besides that, you've got Earthblood. Heals are always good. I think no doubt about that. She can just heal a bunch. And Then you do have Shield of Thorns, which can be used to soup up your squishy units and make them beefier if your opponent doesn't happen to have a source of magic damage. So that's very, very nice. Plus, it boosts your non-AP units. So if you synergize with War Dancers or Wild Riders in particular, you can get a lot of damage out with Shield of Thorns. It's a very, very potent ability there. You do also have 3 rather solid spells for Lore of Shadows. You've got Penumbral Pendulum, which is awesome for nuking enemy main lines. You can use it to annihilate sort of that stable infantry. Let's say Tomb Guard. You need to deal with those. They're blocking your charge as Wood Elves. You drop a Penumbral Pendulum, you've got rid of Tomb Guard. Boom, they're gone. You can do this on enemy archers, on enemy spears, whatever the case may be. Depending on situation, Penumbral Pendulum is good. Melkoth's Miasma, which is a great snare. On a faction that already has a lot of poison, and you've got Curse of Honorair bound on your Sister of Thorn, for example, and you've got Prey of Anathrema, having an extra source of slowage from the Melkoth's Miasma is very, very nice. So that is another point for the Branch Wraith. And then we do have the Withering. And now, as I mentioned, this isn't a very strong spell in Noctilus, but for the high Wood Elves, it can actually be pretty good, because minus 30 armor for an army where you've got Dryads who don't have AP, you've got Wild Riders who aren't AP, you've got War Dancers who aren't AP. All of that can come. All of those can fight a lot better. Deepwood Scouts who don't have AP, and all of those can get much better results when you drop a Withering on a targeted unit. The -8 leadership also isn't bad, because Wood Elves are often a very shock-heavy and shock-and-awe faction, if you go especially for an offensive build. So you can combo that -8 leadership and the -30 armor to help your War Dancers, Dryads, and Deepwood Scouts and Wild Riders just steamroller an enemy position. And so all in all, just 5 great spells, 1 decent or like lower-end okay one. Only the big downside with the Branch Wraith is her passives, so she gets herself an A tier. And finally, we do have the Grey Seers, and you can see there's actually 2 of them, and that's because technically it's 2 different Grey Seers who get a mixed lore. They each get a unique. Their Grey Seers get a spell called the Dreaded 13th, and this replaces a specific spell on Lore of Ruin and Lore of Plague. On Lore of Plague, it replaces your Plague Monk summon. On Lore of Ruin, it replaces Flincing Ruin. And in my opinion, because of that, the tiering varies, because the effect it has on those lores is different. For Lore of Plague, I would say it's a bit of a trade-off, and I would argue it might be as much as a downgrade. So let's say this guy's Lore of Plague. I'm going to put him down to C tier. And it's rather simple. You get normal Lore of Plague, which is already good, but losing the Plague Monk summon and losing that Disrupt and that blocking ability for the way Dreaded 13th works is it's a 200-meter range bombardment ability that does boatloads of damage. It can like nuke an artillery piece instantly and summons Stormer and Halberds for a significant chunk of change, or for a significant chunk of Winds of Magic. So it's a very strong spell potentially, but you are losing the ability to bog your opponents down. You are losing the you are losing the ability to cheaply overrun a backline with Plague Monks, whereas because Stormmen are expensive, so unless you manage to nuke an enemy backline and then your Stormmen and swarm another one, you're gonna have a rough time there. You're basically relying on your Plague Monks a lot of the time, and so losing that is a big opportunity loss. So this guy's a C tier, but the Lore of Ruin, where you lose Flensing Ruin, which is not a very good spell, in my opinion, bumps it up to A tier. It is an improvement over Lore of Ruin. It's just a straight upgrade. It is still a very niche spell and doesn't necessarily open up a huge amount of variety. So this one, it's not a huge difference compared to the normal Lore of Ruin, but I do think it's an improvement. So I'm going to give it an A tier. Maybe it's like a B. I don't know. It's somewhere between B and A. I was going to give it an A, but I think I'll give it a B tier. Maybe bump this one to. I'll keep this one at C, because it's a bit of a trade-off. This one's just a straight upgrade, but it's not something that changes your playstyle entirely most of the time, but it is an improvement. So we'll give it a B tier there. Next up, we are moving into the factions that have a lot of different mixed lores. And first and foremost, we do have the Lore Master of Hoeth. And believe it or not, I'm going to give this guy's lore an A tier, because it's honestly a solid lore of magic. You might be surprised by this, but honestly, his mixed lore brings a lot to the table. I don't think any of the spells included are bad. He lacks passives, which sucks, and that is definitely a point against him, and it's why he's hovering somewhere between A and B for me. And he doesn't get any fancy nuke spells. So I'm probably going to put him at somewhere between, it's going to be a low A. But the spells he gets are rather solid. You've got 6 different Lords of Magic. You've got Wissen's Wild Form, which is probably his weakest link of a spell, which it does okay armor buffage and buffs your non-AP damage a little bit. Can be valuable on a handful of high elf units for sure. You get Spirit Leech and Shim's Burning Gaze, which gives you damage output against low model count or single entities, and a lot of flexibility. You can bring Shem's Burning Gaze against, for example, the Tomb Kings, because they've got a lot of fire weak lords. Or you can bring Spirit Leech against cav heavy factions, like technically like Bretonnia or Empire, or those sorts of factions. You can whittle them down a good bit. You've got Melkoth's Miasma, which is a nice snare and slow and steady source of damage, which if you're doing a sort of grindier build with the high elves can be decent. You've got Earthblood, which gives you nice AoE healing, which is once again very respectable. And finally, you've got Harmonic Convergence, which can really give you a clutch single target buff. So the spell selection on this guy is really good. He has no passives, and of course the character himself isn't very good. And this is really what undermines it. If this guy was just a generic mage, I think we'd see the Lore Master a whole bunch. But because he's not a generic mage, because you pay for those combat stats, and his itemization isn't the greatest, you don't see him very often. But I actually do think he's a rather respectable character. He's got a very respectable lore. And so for that, he's actually going to net himself an A tier. And then we do move on into the legendary lords for the high elves. And first and foremost is Alarielle. And she has really, really good mixed lore magic. I would go as far as saying she might have the strongest mixed lore in the game. The only one that comes close is Manfred. And even there, I'm not sure, just because while she has much less spells to choose from, the ones she gets are stupidly strong. So I'm putting her at S tier. Her passives are both awesome. You get the Life Bloom from Lore of Life, as well as the Shield of Sapphire from Lore of High Magic. So you get ward save plus heals on every cast. And she's got a lot of spammy spells that she can cast. She's got Fast Protection, which is a great AoE melee defense. And Armor Buff can really make your troops a lot beefier, a lot more survivable. She has Earthblood, which allows her to heal those blobs. And really, she's a blob lord, and she's considered a pain in the rear for this. All these spells just promote blobbing, which is disgusting, kind of. But at the same time, arguing it's not strong is just untrue. So she's very strong. You get Earthblood, you've got Fast Protection, you've got Shield of Thorns, which synergizes very nicely with non-AP units, especially like Dragon Princes. You get that extra physical resist, plus the added benefit of more non-AP damage. She gets the... I should mention, her mixed lore is lore of Light, High, and Life. She does also get Tempest, which allows her to just dominate the skies. Tempest is almost single-handedly the reason most factions will not risk air characters or air lords against high elves. It's just a stupidly powerful spell. Honestly, it's probably overpowered for what it is, but Tempest is just insanely good. So Alarielle can deny air plays. She can buff up a blob super, super well. She does have 2 weaker spells. She's got Banishment and Arcane Forging. Arcane Forging has fallen off a whole bunch. As we discussed with Mazda Mundi, it's just not that good of a spell. Too expensive for the damage it does. And the debuff to enemy cooldowns is just too gimmicky and niche to bring the spell constantly, or bring a spell to battle. It's just not a spell worth bringing most of the time, especially now that the greenskins have had WoW reworked. And then a Banishment, which of course it's a Vortex in multiplayer, so it's not reliable. But, you know, that's okay. The remaining spells she has are very, very strong. And so Alarielle gets herself an easy S tier. Next up, Teclis, or nowadays as we see him sometimes, Peclis. And he is a weird one. He doesn't necessarily have the best spell selection, but his lore does have certain synergies that are insanely good, in my opinion, or very, very good, with the High Elf roster as a whole, as well as with himself. So, first and foremost, we've got his passives. Kindle Flame. That's his only passive. It's not even a very good passive a lot of the time, but with High Elves, it happens to be pretty strong. There's a lot of units that do fire damage on the High Elf roster. Dragons and their breath attacks, of course. Sisters of Averlorn. Dragon Princes, or specifically the Fireborn. Teclis himself can imbue fire damage with the Flaming Sword of Ruin. So Kindle Flame is damn strong. Actually. And so he's got a very strong passive. It is a bit niche, and you have to build around it to really make use of it, but is it weak? Absolutely not. So he's got a very strong passive. His spell selection is not the best. He gets some very strong spells, which define him, and then some rather bad spells. So first we'll cover the bad ones. Chain Lightning, Vortex, Multiplayer, enough said. It's not reliable. It's not consistent. Even if you do want to nuke units that you netted down with Net of Mintok, which is one of the strong spells, you're probably better off just using Brown Firing Convocation and saving the Winds of Magic for your other spells. You also do have Flaming Sword of Ruin. This isn't a bad spell per se. It used to be a super critical one for the High Elves because they didn't have much access to magic damage back in the day. Many of you might not remember this, but back after release, the only magic damage High Elves had was Flaming Sword of Ruin and Phoenixes. So against a faction like Undead, who could just bring a boatload of Wraith units, High Elves struggled a lot. It could actually be a serious problem for them. Obviously, times have changed. Larry and the Queen and Crone DLC completely upset that because Larry, of course, got an AoE buff that grants magic damage, so it's completely different now. But Flaming Sword of Ruin has fallen off a bit. It still synergizes really well with Teclis, since it can give your troops Kindle Flame benefits as well as giving them magic damage. He also does get the Flock of Doom, which is a bit meh. You can whittle down blobs of enemy infantry, but once again, Fiery Convocation and Net is often more reliable there. But then you've got the strong spells. You've got Enfeebling Foe, especially synergized with the new and ridiculous Peckless. You can snipe out enemy characters with Enfeebling Foe, especially because the Kindle Flame helps Peckless do more damage. And it synergizes really well with dragons or whatever that you might be sniping with. Of course, Net of Mintok, which allows you to snare an opponent and leave them completely open to getting pulverized by, once again, breath attacks or Sister of Avalorn Fire or that sort of thing. And finally, we do have the Regrowth, which is really good for healing single entities, whether that's Teclis himself or dragons or units like that. It's just a very strong ability. And despite all that, I'm going to give Teclis I'm really on the fence between A and S tier. He's definitely a very high A, if anything. I think I will give him a high A. He's very close to S tier. But because he does have those inferior or mediocre spells, I don't feel like I can really say that lore is that strong. There's like half the spells are just mediocre or bad. And for that, he's going to get an A tier, though I think it's very close. And the passive is just so niche. But it's a strong niche. So A to S, somewhere in there. And with that, we are moving to Vampire accounts. And yeah, might as well start with Mannfred. Easy S. You get 2 Lores of Magic. You can literally get all of Lore of Death, all of Lore of Vampires, all the benefits of both those lores. And you can just pick and choose whichever spells you want. You can customize it to whatever build. Like, I don't even need... There's no sacrifice being made. This is... I'm not sure if I'd say it's better than Alarielle, just because Alarielle has such a... I'm actually going to put it higher than Alarielle, just because there's literally no downside compared to generic Lore of Vampires. Like, at least with Alarielle, you can say, okay, but she doesn't have Net of Mintok. She doesn't get Shem's Burning Gaze. She does have some mess spells in there that are offsetting all these strong spells. Mannfred only has the mess spells that are in the lores he has, but otherwise he's got the full selection of lores, so it's not like he's sacrificing, say, Van Hels's Dance Macabre and getting Purple Son of Zerus instead. No, he just can choose to run Van Hels's Dance Macabre and not worry about Purple Son of Zerus if he wants to. So, yeah, easy S tier. Mannfred's insane. The fact that you get 2 full lores is just really strong, and I can't be stressed enough. But then we do move on to some more interesting stuff with the other lords. Gorst, I'm actually going to put at a D tier for because his lore, in my opinion, is a straight downgrade from normal lore vampires. The only exchange there is, and obviously the Lore of Vampires is a strong lore to begin with, but you are giving up one of the 2 strongest spells. You're losing the Zombie Summon in exchange for Graveguard or White King Summon, and they just do not last long enough to justify the Greater Winds of Magic cost. And yeah, they're just not good. The summon is just a straight, in most cases, just a straight downgrade from zombies. It's not really, it's one of the big downsides to Gorst. And Gorst has kind of found himself a little bit of a home and a niche nowadays, but I think that the Graveguard summon just isn't very good. You need to bring a separate Necromancer to get zombie summons, because Gorst is just a straight downgrade from normal Lore Vampire. So I'm going to give him a D tier, because I don't really think there's much, if any, benefit to his Lore of Magic compared to normal or Lore Vampires, because the Graveguard just does not last long enough to dish out the hurt. It's not really possible to position it well because of how slow Gorst is, and it doesn't really bring anything to the table that Vampire counts don't have elsewhere already. So unfortunate, but it is what it is. Strigoi Vampire lore is a interesting one. You do get 2 Lore of vampire spells, 3 Allure of Death spells, and a unique spell. And so he's got this cool mix. It's for both the normal variant as well as the pseudo legendary lord bloodline variant. They both have the same mixed lore, and in my opinion, it's an interesting side grade compared to lore vampires. It's not necessarily straight better, but it's not necessarily worse. And for that, I'm going to give it a B. I'm going to give it, I think, a B tier because it does open some unique opportunities. First of all, you've got a Crypt Ghoul summon instead of your zombie summon. And you still do have Invocation of the Hag, by the way, so you do keep that one. You do get a Crypt Ghoul summon. Unlike in Gorst's case, the Crypt Ghoul summon is a bit burstier. It can do a bit more damage before it expires, so you drop it on a squishy backline. It can easily do enough damage to justify itself, so that is very strong there. The lore passives, I will say, are not necessarily strong. I do believe you only get the lore of vampires passive, which is obviously not that good. But yeah, you do get the Crypt Ghoul summon, which is very, very nice. In certain situations, you can fly over the enemy, drop it on a squishy ranged unit. Crypt Ghouls will delete them. They can beat up on a unit of Slayers, for example, if you're fighting dwarves. Stuff like that. It's really not a bad ability there. Gates of Nagash is not a bad character sniping spell, and you do also get Spirit Leech. So you do have this option of different customizable single entity or low model count unit snipage, and both Spirit Leech and Gaze of Nagash are not bad for that. Now, granted, you do not have a lot of Winds of Magic generation as the Ghoul King, so that is a bit of a downside there. But just the fact that you can whittle your opponent down over time or snipe out an enemy caster very, very quickly between Gaze of Nagash and charging into melee is very strong. You do also get Soul Blight and Doom and Darkness. Now, these are not necessarily that strong. Soul Blight, though, can be useful in certain cases for vampire accounts because you do have a lot of non-AP troops in some areas. You've Graveguards non-AP, you've got Blood Knights, which are non-AP, so you can get more value out of them that way. And you do also have Doom and Darkness, which can allow you to get a cheapish Terror Bomb going, which vampire accounts you are sometimes going for that Terror Bomb build. There are better lords for it, like Vlad, actually, because he does get an AoE leadership debuff. But, yeah, the Ghoul King it does get this interesting mix. And I wouldn't necessarily say any of his spells are super overtuned. He does open up new opportunities. He can bypass the limit on summons. You actually get a useful summon, and you can still bring a zombie summon alongside him. So you get double summons, essentially, which I think is really nice. And does, in my eyes at least, bump him up to a B tier. And I think his lore is nice. So the last 3 characters here that we have are, in my opinion, a bit interesting when it comes to the mixed lores they have on offer. Of course, we do have the Karstein Lord, the Necrarch Lord, as well as the Lamian Lord, and they're a bit weird. The Karstein Lord, in my opinion, is a weird side grade. Now, he loses... Well, he's basically just got Lore of Vampires. He's got the passive from Lore of Vampires, but he does get 2 Lore of Beast spells, though one is a modified Lore of Beast spell, so it's basically a unique spell. He gets, instead of Gaze of Nagash and instead of Curse of Years, he does get the transformation of Kadon, but it summons a Vargulf instead of a Manticore, and he gets the Flock of Doom. Now, Gaze of Nagash, as much as I like it, and I like to hype it up, it is a bit of a niche spell. And Curse of Years is really probably the weakest spell in the whole Lore of Vampires roster. It's not one you're usually going to bring. So you don't necessarily lose that much. At the same time, Flock of Doom and Transformation Kadon, specifically Transformation Kadon with a Vargulf summon, because you're not getting a Manticore, you're getting a Vargulf, which can be blocked off by enemies. And it's more expensive, and it's easier to prevent from getting where it needs to go. Is less useful. So you're not usually going to bring that Vargulf ability, to be quite honest. You might bring Flock of Doom for Chaff Clear, but it's not a huge boon. So while the lore isn't necessarily a huge downgrade, I don't feel like it actually offers much to the vampire to the vampire counts. And so I'm going to give it I think a high. It's going to be like a mid to high D tier. I think it's a bit better than Gorse. I think Gorse is just a straight downgrade, but I think the side grade benefits of the lore of Karstein's here is not as good as having Gaze of Nagash. I think Gaze of Nagash is more utility than Flock of Doom does, as far as the vampire counts are concerned. You can snipe lords with it. You can't do that with Flock of Doom. And clearing out Chaff for a faction that causes fear and terror on every other unit, or literally causes fear on every unit and terror on like every other unit, it's not that big of a problem. So, in my opinion, it's a D tier lore. It's essentially a mild downgrade. It's not a serious of a downgrade where you're literally losing one of your two best spells for something, but I think it is a downgrade. Next up, we do have the Necrarch, and this one's interesting. This guy's got the lore passive for lore of beasts, death, and vampires. So he does get 2 Winds of Magic generation passives, which is really strong. It means he can generate a lot of Winds of Magic. The spells he gets are an interesting mixed bag. You do, of course, get the 2 key spells from vampires. You've got summons, and you've got Nehek, which is, of course, very strong. You do then get the Spirit Leech, and you do also get Wissen's Wild Form, Purple Son of Zerus, and Curse of Honorair. Now, Spirit Leech is nice. Purple Son of Zerus, not very useful most of the time. It's not a spell you're really going to be bringing. And you keep in mind, you are sacrificing Van Hel's Lance Macabre for this. You are sacrificing the... you are sacrificing Gaze of Nagash. You are sacrificing Wind of Death, which, to be fair, isn't much of a sacrifice. You are sacrificing the Curse of Years. So, yeah, you are losing 2 spells you probably won't use, Wind of Death and Curse of Years. But you are sacrificing Gaze of Nagash and Van Hel's Lance Macabre for this. And you're really... only major gain you get is Spirit Leech. Which does have its nice purposes. You kind of become a budget Manfred, which isn't terrible. But... you miss out on some of this utility. So I'm going to give the Necrarch, I think, a B tier. Because you do have a lot of Winds of Magic, which is cool. You can spam a lot of these spells. You can very much spam your heals. You can spam your summons. You can spam Spirit Leech. But then there are 3 spells that essentially are downgrades from what you'd normally get, or side grades to irrelevant spells. So it's just irrelevant spells that don't really benefit you a huge amount. And for that, I think the lore, I think it deserves a B tier. It's not straight downgrade, it's not a straight upgrade. It's got its benefits, it's got its downsides. It's a cool B tier. I like it, but it's not amazing either. And finally, we've got the Lamian Lord, and I think she's a similar case to the Necrarch. She does get only the vampire passive, and otherwise her lore is a mix of shadows and vampires. You do get Invocation of Nehek and Zombie Summon, of course. The 3rd vampire spell is Wind of Death, which is pretty useless. So what can you do? But she does get Penumbral Pendulum, which is really nice. Great for clearing out lines of any enemy elite halberds, for enemy missile units, that sort of thing. Just a very strong option there. She does get Enfeebling Foe, which is excellent for sniping enemies out, rather than relying on, say, Van Hel's Lance Macabre and then getting blocked by enemies. You can debuff a specific target. It's cheaper and a bit more enduring. It lasts a little longer. You can definitely cripple enemies with Enfeebling Foe and snipe out those key targets with an Air Squad or a Vargol Squad or whatever. And you do have Occam's Mindrazor, which is definitely a niche spell, but it has its perks. Vampire accounts don't have a lot of access to magic damage, which is kind of weird for a faction that's very magic-centric, but they don't actually have much magic damage. They have no lords that do magic damage, except, I guess, Kemler with Cloak of Mist and Shadows. They don't have any heroes besides the Banshee, who herself is vulnerable. So, for example, if you deal with Vampire Pirates, you don't necessarily have the best magic damage in melee, because all your magic damage is either itself vulnerable to magic. So, a Paladin, for example, Damned Paladin can do a lot of damage. And with Occam's Mindrazor, you can kind of offset that because you are giving yourself magic damage, which is pretty neat. And it comes in a Lord, so you don't have to buy an extra hero for it. And for that, I'm going to give her also a B tier. I think she's a little bit above the Necrarch. Somewhere around the Strigoi. Maybe I'd even rank her above the Strigoi, because I'm really partial to the Lamian, though. At that point, I think it's kind of my bias, more so than the lore, but the lore does offer you some benefits for the faction as a whole. You get that magic damage imbuement, you do get debuffs to single targets, you do still get Penumbral Pendulum, which is a cheap way of nuking enemy battle lines that you don't have normally. So all in all, I think it's definitely a solid B tier. You are losing Gaze of Nagash, so that is a bit of safe sniping you're losing. You are losing Van Hel's Lance Macabre, which denies you the ability to get these big AoE buffs. But all in all, I think it's definitely a solid B tier. And Lamian lands there. So that is it for this list, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy and found it educational and interesting. And be sure to leave me your thoughts and opinions down below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. As usual, everything here is subjective. I did my best to try to separate the lords from the lores, but of course it is difficult and kind of almost impossible. But hopefully you guys did enjoy. Be sure to leave those thoughts and opinions down below, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.